From her ability description, unleashing an endless epidemic of contagious spores, Saryn rapidly decomposes her foes with horrifying potency. Erupt caustic pustules to spread her disease, shed deceptive husks to draw enemy fire as she injects lethal venom and exhales deadly viruses to cleanse the system with her toxic touch. Last video, I suggested that Saryn's spores are communicating by quantum entanglement, and that's how they know how to increase in potency, which was dumb. I realized there is actually a much more viable biological explanation for Saryn's disease. So, first, Saryn's first ability specifically states she spreads spores, which are a main hallmark of fungi such as mushrooms. These are a multicellular organism. A lot of them are quite small, and they're very often found decomposing dead matter. There are two components to them. There's the mycelium and the spores. And the spores are how they spread around. So as the spore's damage type is corrosive, these spores are likely secreting an acid to do their damage. But that damage is quite low if just one person is infected, and I believe that this is because the Orokin designed Saryn as a weapon, and a weapon that kills one person isn't that effective. In nature, a successful disease is one that doesn't kill its host, but can still be passed on to cause more infections. Sexually transmitted infections such as gonorrhea are great examples of these. Whereas the Ebola virus, which has a high lethality but low infection rate, is quote-unquote not successful because often the hosts die before they can spread their disease too far. And this is because humans are not the viral reservoir of Ebola, and the host species, thought to be bats, doesn't die from this infection. I'm going to be putting terms on the screen as I talk about them, because while I'm trying to give brief explanations, some of you may want more information on various things, and I encourage you to look those up. So I believe Saryn spores are the opposite philosophy in nature, in that they want to kill as many victims as possible, so it purposely has low infection rates and high lethality. It has a low infection rate because it cannot be spread unless it's on purpose. I believe this could be to prevent unwanted infections of civilians. The spores get stronger with more people infected, and this suggests that the spores are communicating. There is a method used by bacteria to communicate with each other. This is known as quorum sensing. Quorum sensing is when bacteria secrete molecules that are taken up by surrounding bacteria of the same species that are also secreting this molecule, and this is done to manage population densities among other things, but we won't get into that here. Essentially, I believe that Saryn spores are secreting a molecule that can be taken up by other spores, and this leads to various cellular responses. This could be, an example of this could be an activation of a channel protein, which is a tube that goes from inside the cell to the outside, that lets more acid out of the cell. I specifically think it could be a channel protein because activating any sort of gene change at a genetic level isn't that likely with how fast it's reacting. I think the acid is always being made within the cell, and as soon as those channel proteins are open, it just gets released. That lets it affect really fast, rapid changes, which is kind of what the idea is here. And so that's how they're increasing the damage and the amount of acid that the spores are secreting. Spores cannot be spread unless on purpose. The spores themselves are likely made of a highly rigid and tough material that can withstand most impacts but will still burst to a bullet or a massive dose of radiation. And let's be honest, most biological materials will do this. Saryn's toxic lash, or her 3, instantly bursts and spreads spores. And I think this is just because the toxin instantly breaks down the outer layer or cell membrane of a spore, and that allows it to spread. Saryn's 4, which is called miasma, specifically deals viral damage, and this does extra damage to infected enemies with spores, and it will also spread those spores of any infected enemies that die under the effect of miasma. So miasma, this miasma that Saryn releases obviously contains a highly lethal virus, such as Ebola. as we mentioned earlier. It deals more damage to spore infectees. I believe that the miasma also contains a highly concentrated dose of the molecule that the spores are using to communicate with each other, meaning the more molecules that the spores take up, the more channel proteins open and the more acid gets released into a person. And this means that this allows more and more damage to be done in a highly controlled way, in that the more molecules, the more channel proteins, the more acid, and you can control that. And so that's how I think Saryn spores are operating. That's all for now. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want me to do anything else. Thank you so much for listening.